Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. This was a book that I listened to on audiobook, so I don't have anything to show you besides the Goodreads entry. I'm going to be looking at my notes over here. I have read one other book by Grady Hendrix, that was How to Sell a Haunted House. I also listened to that on audiobook earlier this year, so I was already familiar with Grady Hendrix's writing style, but this one was a little different, and I will talk about some of the differences from How to Sell a Haunted House versus this Witchcraft for Wayward Girls when we get a little bit further into this review. So right off the bat, I just want to provide a little bit of background. I am not really a horror person. This is not something that I typically gravitate towards. The cover looks pretty cool. There's like this lava lamp with like a hand in it. And I kind of like the concept, so it was on my TBR, but it was freaky, and having read or gory, it was scary, at least for me. I don't handle horror well though, so my bar for that is quite low. But I knew it was probably going to be a little freakier going into it, having read something else by Grady Hendrix and understanding that that was the kind of stuff that he liked to write. So do know that my aversion to gore or horror, or some of the stuff in here might be considered body horror, and spooky stuff in general, is going to color the way I review this book. So this book is about a woman, Miss Wellwood, who runs a home, Wellwood Home in St. Augustine, Florida. And we're following a protagonist who we know for most of the book by the name Fern. So Wellwood Home is a home where girls were sent who got pregnant. So these would be teenage girls who got pregnant, and this was considered quite disgraceful. And Fern, we find as a 15-year-old girl in 1970, I believe was the year, gets sent there because she gets pregnant by her high school boyfriend. Her family sends her there because it's super embarrassing. They try to like bounce her around to a family home, and she winds up getting really bored there and getting into trouble. So they send her to this home down in Florida where the idea is girls go there, they live out the rest of their pregnancy, usually around the time they start showing, and then their family can make up a cover story about where they've been all summer, whether they've been lifeguarding or Fern's pretending to be at drama camp. They give birth to the baby is immediately adopted out to a family, and then the girl returns home, and the idea is they can just continue with their life. The family doesn't have to deal with the consequences, the girl doesn't have to deal with the consequences, and the baby can have a good life. Of course, any of us who are an adult can probably look at this and immediately notice some red flags, but this is what was happening, and this was the way that things were going to be dealt with. The girls at the school use fake names, which is why Fern is not her real name, but it's a name assigned to her, because the idea is you want to go in, you want to have a fake name, you don't want to talk about your past, you go to the hospital as a Jane Doe, you sign your birth certificate as a Jane Doe, and essentially you can kind of leave this chapter of your life behind. Of course, I feel like anyone who's had a kid, or even if you haven't had a kid, I've never had a kid, I know that you're probably not going to give birth to a kid and then adopt that child out immediately and just never think about it again. So obviously this is kind of a complex situation, but Fern winds up in this home. It's a very strict home. Miss Wellwood is very strict about the rules, and you immediately start to think that maybe there's a personal element, or I picked up very early on that there probably was a personal element to this for Miss Wellwood, which comes up later in the book. I will just say, I'll leave it at that. But when Fern is there, she immediately starts to meet other girls in the same situation. Prior to this, she's just been hiding her condition. She's felt very alone and isolated. But at this school, despite being under very strict guidance and rules and a lot of restrictions, there is a sort of camaraderie that builds with these girls who are all in the same boat. There's a lot of talk from the women in charge of this home about consequences. And of course, we see this like amount of outrage and powerlessness the girls feel, where they're having to have these consequences while the men get to walk free. And we have people like Fern, who got pregnant by a boyfriend, although viewing the situation as an adult woman, I think a lot of us who are adult women can see that there's problems with the relationship that Fern was in. But some of these girls are here who have truly been victims of horrendous abuse, and their abuse is not being taken seriously, and the girl is being considered the one who's the sinner, and the family hasn't believed the abuse that's being reported by the girls, and they're being sent to these homes instead. So there's a wide range of situations that have gotten to these girls into their predicament, basically. And the girls throughout the book have this sense of hopelessness and powerlessness as every other adult in their life is trying to tell them what's best. The whole story also has this difficult element in that, looking at the situation from an adult, most of us can recognize that a 15-year-old is not going to raise an emotionally healthy and competent child, at least not without a significant amount of additional parental support. A 15-year-old doesn't have the capacity to raise a child by herself. She can't have a job. At least there's not going to be a job that can really support her and her baby. And in the culture of the time, the parents are clearly not supportive. They're sending their kid off to Florida. They're not going to provide the scaffolding and social support for these girls to raise the kid, which would really be the only way they could be successful at this. So you do understand these girls are really not fit to be the mother of these children, but at the same time, you understand that a lot of choices are being made for them, that they themselves are not fully, they're not being given the full information. They're being lied to a lot of the times. They're not being taken seriously when they have concerns, and they're being given a lot of misinformation. So in this state of powerlessness, Fern and a few other girls at the school start getting mixed up with a librarian who starts coming in her bookmobile. It's very quickly revealed that the librarian is actually a witch. She has a coven, and she's offering these girls the ability to have a little bit of power. And the appeal of having power and agency for girls who have so little power and agency in their life is, of course, very tempting. And they start to get mixed up in something that is much bigger than them. And different girls have different aims. Some just want revenge. They start really innocently by taking away the morning sickness, the horrendous morning sickness from this one girl. And you, at this point, are really cheering for these girls because there's this horrendous doctor who's at the clinic who is telling the girls that they're just like psychologically, the phrase that the book used was like, you're psychosexually immature and that's why you have morning sickness. And of course it's like a creepy old male doctor who has never had morning sickness in his life. And the doctor is kind of contrasted with another employee in the house who has worked as like or at least has some sort of training in midwifery. But yes, they are able to take the morning sickness away from one of the girls using witchcraft and give it to the doctor. And having a little bit of ability to take control and agency of their own situation in a situation where they have no information, no agency, and no power is, of course, very tantalizing and very tempting. It starts to get revealed slowly that the witch might not have entirely pure motives, and of course there's always a cost, there's always a price to be paid, but that's also kind of the line that Miss Wellwood and her home is pushing, is you have to pay the price of your sins. Of course, leaving aside the whole complex thing that none of these men are paying the crimes of the prices of their sins, the men who have gotten these women pregnant, and also that some of these women are legitimate victims of abuse who are just being, the abuse is just being perpetuated by the home, and nothing's being done about that. But you start to get torn as the reader between wanting these girls to succeed, but maybe not wanting them to use the witchcraft power that they're starting to get drawn deeper and deeper into to achieve their aims. So the book, I'm not going to go too far into how it ends, but the girls are being forced to make a choice. And throughout the book, there's a sense of powerlessness of these girls as they try to just take any amount of agency in a situation that just in no case can end well. It's one of these books where in no case, there's really no good outcome. When a girl that young is pregnant, when a girl that young, you have the whole separate issue. One of the girls' name is Holly, and she's been abused by her pastor, or her minister, which you immediately see right away. The moment all the players were introduced, I knew exactly what had happened in that situation, but it is slowly revealed throughout the book. You have that whole situation, horrendous. She's not believed, mostly because her parents don't want to believe her because the minister has taken one of their daughters that they can't really take care of off their hands. You have girls who just don't have the money or the emotional capacity or the ability to give birth to a child and raise it right now. But also you are in horror of the home that is abusing these girls and purporting to help them, but actually just continuing to make a miserable situation out of their situations and to lie to them. You get really upset at the injustice that these girls are facing, being really treated like the scum of society, especially when you know deep in your heart that there's a bunch of high school boys who get to live their life without any consequences. And you're also kind of upset, or there's a part of you that the witch kind of scares you and her powers scare you, and understanding that she's possibly also preying on these girls, even though she's seeming to help them at the same time. She's offering something, but there's a price to be paid. So it is a difficult situation all around. Now, the difference between Oh, and a few warnings before I go into this. I'm not going to talk about it deeply, but there's a lot of childbirth scenes in this, and I did kind of fast forward through some of them, like just the 15-second skip to kind of get the picture. And there's some stuff that I would probably consider body horror. I mean, childbirth in and of itself, when written in this manner, felt like body horror, but there was some stuff that was like non-natural pregnancies. I don't know how to describe it, like supernatural, like there was some magic stuff that went on. So there's quite a bit of that in there. If that does scare you, or if that's something that you just don't like, do not read this book. So now into the comparison with the other Grady Hendrix book that I read, How to Sell a Haunted House. I think the thing that scared me most, or the thing that was the most horrifying about this book, is how little of it was really fiction. When you have How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix, the premise of that book was there was these haunted puppets that were like haunting the house. And even though I was listening to that book and it was scary and it was gory and it was kind of freaky, like in my head, I know that I don't have haunted puppets in my attic. Like there was a part of it that I was able to separate from real life. But I think the horrifying part of this book was if you took out the witches, it was very close to being just a real life account of how girls like this were treated in 1970. And some of the horrors that happened, the horrors that were happening with abuse not being believed. And I should also add some like these things still occur today, but like just very young girls being abused. Girls in really difficult situations being abused, children being brought into the world that are then taken away from their mothers against their mother's will, even after some of these girls have requested to not adopt out their babies, just being like locked on medical wards, the amount of casual racism that was still just in society. At one point, there's some police officers who show up, and there's two girls in the home who are like suspects or they're in trouble. And the police officers say, what does he say? He says, we don't mix. And I thought what he was saying when I was listening to the audiobook was that he didn't want the suspects in the same police car, because he didn't want the suspects to like collaborate on a story before they got to the police station or to hear what the other person was saying. Like they wanted to keep the suspects separate so they could get stories independent of them and compare. And then it was like very quickly revealed that they were actually saying like you needed to ride in separate cars. And the amount and one of the girls is dropped off at the home after dark because the mother like didn't feel safe driving down through Florida through the South because like of her race. And so there was just the amount of also the horrendous practices that were being done to these women in labor. And by horrendous, I mean like the women had no agency in labor on how they were going to labor or when they were going to get pain relief. They were treated very condescendingly and cruelly in the hospital by medical staff. There was a lot of this book that was horrifying that wasn't even about witchcraft or like the fantastical. And I feel like that's what made it infinitely worse than the How to Sell a Haunted House, because How to Sell a Haunted House had an element that I could just remove as pure fiction. And this just had a lot of stuff that I know actually did happen and was just like a little too uncomfortably close to the truth, while also having a witchcraft element that kept things, I'm gonna say fun, but there wasn't a whole lot of fun about this book. Overall, this was kind of like a split review. This book was not for me. It was very horrifying, very bloody, very disgusting, but also I was gripped like throughout the entire book. So when I say not for me, I meant I wasn't really reading it for fun, but I did actually kind of like the book overall, not in the sense that I had fun reading it. I don't really know how to describe this, but I would give it about a 4-star, to be honest, even though it was like definitely not my cup of tea. I don't gravitate towards this stuff. I don't like body horror. But this one, not only did I think it was much better than How to Sell a Haunted House, but also something about it was just compelling in a way that the other one was just felt like a fun horror romp, sort of. This one kind of felt much more serious and dark in tone, and also I felt like it was much more compelling and gripping throughout. I would love to hear if you do read horror, if you have read this book, or even if you don't and you read this book, what your thoughts and opinions of it are. I'm looking forward to meeting with my book club to discuss, because I think they're going to have a lot of interesting things to say. And I would love to hear what you think about this book. So please leave them in the comment section down below. It makes my day when I get the notification that I have another comment. I have a great time reading your comments. So thank you so much for leaving those. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.